The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. At 26 years old, he had been serving as one of the Queen's Guard for 3 years, but today felt different somehow. The weight of his bearskin hat seemed heavier than usual, and the morning air carried an unusual tension that made his fingers grip his rifle just a bit tighter. James had always prided himself on his unwavering composure. During his training, instructors had drilled into him and his fellow guardsmen the absolute importance of maintaining their stoic demeanor, regardless of what happened around them. Tourists could make faces, children could cry, pigeons could land on their heads, and they were expected to remain as still and emotionless as the palace walls themselves. Growing up in a small town outside Manchester, James never imagined he would one day be standing guard at one of the most famous palaces in the world. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a school teacher. They had instilled in him values of duty, respect, and service to others. When he decided to join the military after finishing school, his parents couldn't have been prouder. The day he was selected to serve as one of the Queen's Guard was perhaps the happiest day of his family's life. The morning routine was always the same. James would arrive at the palace grounds before dawn, go through the detailed uniform inspection, receive his briefings about any special events or security concerns for the day, and then take his position. Today he was assigned to the main entrance, where hundreds of tourists would gather throughout the day to take photographs and watch the famous guards in their iconic uniforms. As the first groups of visitors began to arrive, James settled into the familiar rhythm of his duty. His eyes remained fixed forward, his expression blank, his body perfectly still. Children pointed and waved, hoping for any reaction. Adults snapped countless photos, sometimes getting uncomfortably close. James had learned to tune it all out, to become almost like a statue in his own mind. But something about this particular morning felt unusual. Perhaps it was the way the light was hitting the palace walls, or maybe it was the excited chatter of a school group that had just arrived for their tour. James couldn't quite put his finger on what was different, but there was an energy in the air that seemed to reach right through his professional armor. The school group consisted of about 30 children, probably around 8 or 9 years old, accompanied by several teachers and parent volunteers. They were clearly on a special trip to London, their faces bright with excitement and wonder as they approached the famous guards. James could hear their teacher explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard, telling them about the discipline and dedication required for such an important role. One little girl in the group caught James's attention, though he was careful not to let his gaze linger. She had curly brown hair tied back with a bright yellow ribbon, and she was wearing a small backpack covered in patches from what appeared to be various places her family had visited. Unlike the other children who were chattering excitedly, she seemed quieter, more observant, studying the guards with a serious expression that seemed far beyond her years. As the morning progressed, James maintained his position with the same dedication he had shown every day for the past 3 years. Tourists came and went, cameras flashed, and the usual attempts to make the guards react continued. Through it all, James remained the perfect example of British military discipline, a living symbol of the tradition and ceremony that surrounded the royal family. However, as the day wore on, something was building beneath the surface of his professional composure. It started as just a slight awareness, a feeling that today might bring something unexpected. James had learned to trust his instincts during his military training, and right now, those instincts were telling him that this would be no ordinary day of guard duty. The palace grounds grew busier as the morning turned to afternoon, but James's attention kept returning to that school group, particularly the quiet girl with the yellow ribbon in her hair. There was something about her presence that seemed to pierce through the routine of his daily duties, though he couldn't yet understand why. The afternoon sun climbed higher in the London sky, and the crowds around Buckingham Palace grew thicker. James maintained his rigid stance, but his trained peripheral vision allowed him to observe the continuous stream of visitors without moving his head even a fraction of an inch. Tour guides led groups past him, explaining the significance of the guards' uniforms, the history of the regiment, and the unwavering dedication required for such service. The school group had moved closer to where James stood, and their teacher was now pointing directly at him while explaining the role of the Queen's Guard to her students. James could hear every word, though his expression remained completely neutral. The teacher spoke about how these guards were real soldiers, not just ceremonial figures, and how they had often served in various military operations around the world, before earning the honor of protecting the royal family. What the teacher said next made something stir deep within James's chest. Though outwardly he remained as motionless as ever, she told the children that many of the guards had made significant sacrifices for their country, that some had been away from their families for long periods, and that others had experienced things that most people couldn't imagine. She spoke about the courage it took not just to serve in dangerous places, but also to stand here day after day, representing something greater than themselves. The quiet girl with the yellow ribbon had positioned herself directly in front of James, about 6 feet away. While her classmates were busy taking pictures and trying to make the guard smile, she simply stood there looking at him with an expression of profound respect and understanding that seemed impossible for someone so young. Her teacher had to call her name twice before she rejoined the group for their next stop on the tour. As the school group prepared to move on, James noticed something that made his heart skip a beat, though his face showed no reaction. The little girl had quietly separated herself from the group once again and was walking back toward him. In her small hand, she carried something that James couldn't quite see from his position, but her determined expression suggested this was important to her. The girl approached until she was standing just a few feet away from James. Her classmates and teachers hadn't yet noticed her absence, as they were gathered around another guard further down the entrance. For a moment, the girl and the guard simply looked at each other, though James's gaze remained technically focused straight ahead. But there was a connection there, an unspoken communication that transcended the formal barriers of his duty. Then the girl did something that caught James completely off guard. She reached into her small backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a hand-drawn picture. Even from his position, James could see that it was a drawing of a soldier, complete with a red uniform and tall black hat. At the bottom of the picture, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe." But what happened next was what would stay with James for the rest of his life. The little girl didn't just hold up the picture like other children might have done, hoping for a reaction. Instead, she very carefully placed it on the ground in front of him, stepped back, and did something extraordinary. She stood perfectly straight, brought her small hand up to her forehead in a salute that was surprisingly proper for a child her age, and held it there for several long seconds. The sincerity in her gesture was overwhelming. This wasn't a child playing or trying to be cute for the cameras. This was a young person showing genuine respect and gratitude in the only way she knew how. As she held her salute, James could see tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she maintained her serious expression with a determination that reminded him of his own military training. Other visitors in the area began to notice what was happening. Cameras started turning toward the girl and the guard, but the moment remained pure and untainted by the attention. The little girl maintained her salute until she was satisfied that she had properly honored the guard, then lowered her hand and stepped back. James felt something building inside him that he had never experienced during his 3 years of service. His training, his discipline, his professional pride, all of it was being challenged by the simple, heartfelt gesture of a child who somehow understood the weight of what he carried. The picture lying on the ground in front of him seemed to represent more than just a drawing. It was a bridge between his duty and his humanity. The girl's teacher finally noticed her absence and called out to her. But before rejoining her group, the little girl looked up at James one more time. In that look, James saw something that shook him to his core. It wasn't just admiration or curiosity. It was recognition. Somehow this child understood that beneath the uniform and the ceremony was a real person who had made real sacrifices. As the little girl rejoined her school group, and they began to move away from his position, James felt something fundamental shifting inside him. The drawing remained on the ground in front of him, and every fiber of his being wanted to look down at it, to really see what this child had created for him. But his training held firm, and he continued to stare straight ahead, even as his heart pounded beneath his red tunic. The crowd around the palace entrance continued to grow, but James barely noticed the usual parade of tourists and their cameras. His mind was entirely focused on what had just happened. In 3 years of service, he had received countless attempts at interaction from visitors, People had tried to make him laugh to startle him, to get any kind of reaction. Children had cried, adults had made jokes, and teenagers had posed for countless selfies beside him. But none of it had ever penetrated the professional barrier he had built around himself. This was different. The little girl's gesture had been so pure, so genuinely respectful, that it had reached a part of him that James thought he had successfully locked away during his military service. It reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place, and of the people he was ultimately serving to protect. James's thoughts drifted to his own childhood, to the first time he had seen soldiers in uniform. He remembered being about the same age as the little girl, attending a Memorial Day ceremony in his hometown. His grandfather, a World War II veteran, had taken him by the hand and explained what the soldiers represented. "They stand for all of us," his grandfather had said. "They carry our hopes and our gratitude even when we forget to show it." Now, standing in his own uniform decades later, James understood what his grandfather had meant. But he also understood something his grandfather hadn't mentioned: the weight that came with carrying other people's hopes and gratitude, especially when your own hopes and fears had to be pushed aside for the sake of duty. The afternoon was growing warmer, and James could feel perspiration beginning to form beneath his heavy uniform. The bearskin hat, which normally felt manageable, seemed to be pressing down on him with unusual weight. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that was challenging him now. It was the emotional storm that the little girl's gesture had unleashed. More school groups arrived throughout the afternoon, and James watched them approach with a new awareness. These weren't just tourists coming to gawk at the funny uniforms and try to make the guards break character. These were children learning about service, about tradition, about the idea that some people choose to put the needs of others before their own comfort and safety. One particular moment nearly broke James's composure entirely. A teacher from another school group was explaining to her students that the guards they were seeing might have served in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, that some of them might have lost friends in battle, and that their service here at the palace was both an honor and a responsibility that they took very seriously. James had indeed served in Afghanistan during his earlier military career. He had seen things that no person should have to see, lost friends who would never come home to their families, and carried experiences that sometimes woke him up in the middle of the night even now. The teacher's words, meant to educate her students, hit him like a physical blow because they were so accurate. But it was what one of the students said in response that really shook him. A young boy, probably no older than 10, raised his hand and asked, "Do they ever get sad about the friends they lost? Are they sad right now even though they can't show it?" The teacher paused, clearly not expecting such a profound question from someone so young. She looked toward James and the other guards visible in the area, then back at her student. "I think," she said carefully, "that they probably do feel sad sometimes. But they've learned to be strong for all of us even when it's hard." Those words hit James harder than any training exercise or military discipline ever had. The simple acknowledgement that he might be carrying sadness, that his stoic exterior might be concealing very real human emotions, felt like someone had finally seen him as more than just a uniform and a tradition. The drawing was still lying on the ground in front of him, and James found himself desperately wanting to see what the little girl had drawn. He could make out the basic shape of a soldier, but the details were lost from his elevated position. More than that, he wanted to understand why this particular gesture had affected him so deeply when countless others had not. As the afternoon wore on, James realized that something fundamental had changed in him. The armor of professional detachment that he had worn for 3 years was beginning to crack, not because he was becoming less disciplined, but because he was remembering why that discipline mattered in the first place. The shadows began to lengthen across the palace courtyard as the day moved into late afternoon. James had been standing at his post for hours, but the usual fatigue that came with maintaining such rigid posture was overshadowed by the emotional journey he had been experiencing since the little girl's visit. The drawing remained on the ground before him, a constant reminder of the moment that had begun to change everything. Other guards would be relieved in shifts throughout the day, but James's schedule meant he would remain at his post until evening. Normally, this would be just another part of the routine, but today each passing hour brought new waves of reflection and internal struggle. He found himself thinking about conversations he had avoided, feelings he had pushed aside, and connections he had neglected in service of his unwavering dedication to duty. A gentle breeze picked up, and James watched with growing anxiety as it began to lift the corners of the drawing. The thought of losing this precious gift, this tangible proof that someone had seen him as more than just a ceremonial figure, filled him with an urgency he had never felt while on duty. But he remained motionless, bound by the same discipline that had defined his service for 3 years. The crowds began to thin slightly as families with young children started to leave for dinner, but the palace grounds remained busy with tourists and visitors. James noticed that several people had seen the drawing on the ground and were pointing it out to their companions. Some took pictures of it, seemingly understanding that it represented something special, even if they didn't know the story behind it. One elderly gentleman approached James's position with a different energy than most visitors. Unlike the typical tourist trying to get a reaction, this man walked with the bearing of someone who understood military service. He wore a small pin on his jacket that James recognized as a service medal, and when he stopped in front of the drawing, he did something unexpected. He removed his hat and stood quietly for a moment, not looking at James but clearly acknowledging what the drawing represented. When the man finally looked up at James, there was a recognition in his eyes that spoke of shared experience. He didn't try to make James break character or smile. Instead, he simply nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked away. But before leaving, James heard him say quietly, "Well done, soldier." Those 2 simple words carried more weight than any formal commendation James had ever received. They represented acknowledgement not just of his current service, but of everything that had brought him to this moment, all the sacrifices and challenges and difficult choices that had led him to stand guard at one of the most important buildings in the country. As the afternoon continued, James found his thoughts turning to his family back home. His parents had visited him in London once since he began serving as one of the Queen's Guard, and he remembered how proud they had been to see him in his uniform. But he also remembered feeling distant from them, as if the experiences he had gained through his military service had created a barrier that made normal family conversations difficult. His mother had asked him about his time in Afghanistan, and he had given her the same carefully neutral responses he gave everyone who asked about his military service. He had protected her from the reality of what he had seen and done, just as he now stood protecting the palace and everyone inside it. But in doing so, he had also protected himself from the comfort and understanding that his family's love might have provided. The little girl's gesture had somehow pierced through all of these protective barriers. Her simple recognition of his humanity, her acknowledgement of the sacrifices that came with his service, had reminded him that being strong didn't always mean being alone. Sometimes being strong meant allowing others to see and appreciate what you were carrying. A new group of visitors approached, and among them was a young father carrying his daughter on his shoulders. The little girl, probably about 4 years old, was wearing a tiny dress that looked remarkably similar to the uniform James was wearing, complete with a small hat that mimicked his own bearskin headpiece. When her father pointed at James and explained that she was dressed like one of the Queen's Guards, the little girl's face lit up with delight. But instead of trying to get James to react, the father did something beautiful. He told his daughter that the real guard was doing a very important job, that he was protecting everyone around him, and that they should be grateful for his service. Then he helped his daughter wave respectfully at James, explaining that even though the guard couldn't wave back, he could see her and he appreciated her kindness. James felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he watched this interaction. The father was teaching his daughter the same lesson that the little girl with the drawing had already learned, that the people in uniform were real people deserving of respect and gratitude. But more than that, he was showing her how to express that gratitude in a way that honored the constraints of James's duty. The internal pressure James had been feeling all day was reaching a breaking point. 3 years of maintaining perfect composure, of keeping his emotions locked away behind professional discipline, of standing as a symbol rather than a person, were being challenged by these simple acts of human recognition and respect. The evening light was beginning to cast a golden glow across the palace grounds when James felt the first tear escape from his eye. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone who might be watching, but to James it represented the complete breakdown of everything he had been trained to maintain. For 3 years he had stood at various posts around the palace, In rain and shine, through heat waves and cold snaps, maintaining perfect composure regardless of what was happening around him. Now, a single tear was rolling down his cheek beneath his bearskin hat, and James felt both terrified and relieved by its presence. The weight of suppressed emotions from years of military service, from losses in Afghanistan, from the isolation that came with always having to be strong for everyone else, was finally finding a crack in the armor he had built around himself. The drawing on the ground in front of him seemed to glow in the evening light, and James realized that he was no longer just thinking about the little girl who had left it. He was thinking about everyone she represented, all the people who depended on soldiers and guards and service members to keep them safe, and who rarely had the opportunity to express their gratitude in such a pure and meaningful way. More tears followed the first, and James found himself engaged in the most difficult battle of his military career. Not against an enemy force or a dangerous situation, but against his own training and discipline. Every instinct he had developed over years of service was telling him to regain control, to push these emotions back down, to restore the professional detachment that had defined his identity as a guard. But another part of him, a part that had been buried under years of necessary toughness, was telling him that this moment was exactly what he had been serving for all along. This connection with the people he protected, this recognition of the shared humanity that existed between him and the civilians who depended on his service, was the real purpose behind all the ceremony and tradition. A woman in the crowd noticed that something was different about James. She was standing about 15 feet away with her teenage son, and James could see her pointing discreetly in his direction. But instead of the usual tourist reaction of trying to get a better photo or video, she seemed to recognize that she was witnessing something significant. The woman approached slowly, and when she was close enough to see the drawing on the ground and the tears on James's face, she stopped. She didn't try to get his attention or make him acknowledge her presence. Instead, she simply stood there quietly, as if keeping vigil with him during this moment of vulnerability. Her teenage son started to ask what they were doing, but she quietly shushed him and explained in whispers that sometimes people who serve others need to know that their service is seen and appreciated. She told her son that they were witnessing a moment of human connection that was more important than any tourist attraction. Other people in the crowd began to notice the unusual scene. Instead of the typical atmosphere of entertainment and curiosity that usually surrounded the guards, a mood of respect and solemnity began to spread. Conversations became quieter, cameras were lowered, and people seemed to intuitively understand that they were witnessing something sacred. James could feel the attention, but for the first time in his career as a guard, it didn't feel intrusive or challenging. Instead, it felt supportive, as if all these strangers had somehow become a community united in recognizing and honoring his service. The little girl's simple gesture had created ripples that were now touching dozens of people. The tears continued to flow, and James realized that he was no longer fighting them. The discipline that had defined him for so long was still there, but it was being transformed rather than abandoned. He was learning that true strength sometimes meant allowing others to see your humanity. That perfect composure wasn't always the highest form of service. A small group of children from another school tour approached with their teacher, and when they saw the drawing on the ground and the respectful crowd that had gathered, they instinctively understood that they were in the presence of something important. Without being told, they formed a quiet line and stood silently, their young faces serious with the recognition that this was a moment for respect rather than play. One of the children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, carefully approached the edge of where the drawing lay. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small British flag on a wooden stick, the kind that children often wave during royal celebrations. Very gently, he placed it next to the drawing and stepped back to rejoin his group. This simple addition to the impromptu memorial created another wave of emotion for James. The flag represented everything he had sworn to protect, but seeing it placed there by a child's hands reminded him that what he was really protecting was the innocence and freedom that allowed children to feel safe enough to show such gestures of appreciation. As the evening shadows grew longer, James realized that this day had changed him permanently. The careful barriers he had maintained between his duty and his emotions, between his service and his humanity, had not been destroyed but transformed. He was discovering that it was possible to be both a disciplined soldier and a feeling human being. That the best service came not from suppressing his humanity, but from allowing it to inform and strengthen his commitment to others. Word of the unusual scene at the palace gates began to spread through social media and among the gathered crowds. People who had witnessed James's emotional moment started sharing the story, not in a way that mocked or exploited him, but in a manner that celebrated the humanity they had observed. Photos of the drawing and the small flag, along with respectful descriptions of what had transpired, began to appear online with hashtags like MAGA Real Hero and Humanity in Uniform. James was unaware of the growing attention his moment was receiving in the digital world, but he could sense the change in the atmosphere around him. The usual chaos of tourist activity had been replaced by something resembling a memorial service. People were approaching his position not to try to make him break character, but to pay their respects to what he represented. An elderly woman, probably in her 80s, made her way slowly through the crowd with the help of a walking stick. When she reached the front of the gathering, she looked at the drawing and the flag, then up at James's face with its visible tears. She smiled gently and said, "Just loud enough for those nearby to hear. My husband was a soldier in World War II. He would have understood exactly what you're feeling right now." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small poppy flower, the kind worn in Britain to remember fallen soldiers. Very carefully, she placed it next to the drawing and the flag, creating what was now clearly a small but powerful memorial. "For all of them," she whispered, "the ones who came home and the ones who didn't." This addition broke something open in James that he hadn't even known was closed. The poppy represented not just the abstract concept of military service, but the specific friends and colleagues he had lost during his deployment in Afghanistan. Men and women who had died too young, who would never have the opportunity to stand where he was standing, who would never know whether their sacrifice had been appreciated by the people they died protecting. The tears were flowing freely now, and James made no attempt to stop them. For the first time in years, he was allowing himself to grieve not just as a soldier who had lost comrades, but as a human being who had lost friends. The little girl's drawing had somehow given him permission to feel everything he had been holding back, all the sadness and loss and gratitude that came with a life dedicated to serving others. More people began to approach the growing memorial. A man who introduced himself as a veteran of the Falklands War placed a military coin next to the other items. A woman whose son was currently serving in the Royal Navy left a small stone she said came from a beach near the naval base where he was stationed. Each addition was made with quiet reverence, and each one added to the weight of recognition and remembrance that was building around James's position. A news reporter who had been covering tourist activities at the palace noticed the gathering crowd and approached to investigate. But when she realized what was happening, she put away her camera and notebook and simply stood with the others. Later, she would write about the experience. But in the moment, she understood that her role was not to document, but to participate in the communal recognition of service and sacrifice. James began to think about his fellow guards, both those currently serving and those who had served before him. He thought about the countless hours they had all spent standing in similar positions, maintaining the same disciplined composure, carrying the same unspoken burdens. He realized that his breakdown was not just his own, but was somehow representing all of them, giving voice to the shared experience of service members who rarely had the opportunity to express their true feelings about their duty. The crowd had grown to over 100 people, but the atmosphere remained respectful and quiet. Parents were explaining to their children what was happening, using the moment to teach lessons about gratitude, service, and the importance of recognizing the humanity in those who serve others. Teachers from the various school groups present were helping their students understand that they were witnessing something significant about the relationship between those who serve and those who are served. As the sun began to set behind the palace walls, James realized that his shift would be ending soon. The thought of leaving this position, of breaking the connection that had formed between him and all these people who had gathered to honor his service, filled him with a complex mix of relief and sadness. He had been transformed by this day, but he also understood that he would need to figure out how to carry this transformation forward into the rest of his military career. The drawing, the flag, the poppy, and the other small tokens left by visitors had created an impromptu shrine that seemed to glow in the golden evening light. James knew that protocol would require these items to be removed once his shift ended, but he also knew that the meaning they represented would stay with him forever. The little girl who had started it all was long gone, probably at home having dinner with her family, completely unaware of the profound impact her simple gesture had created. The moment James had been both dreading and anticipating finally arrived. His replacement guard approached from the palace interior, walking with the same measured pace and dignified bearing that James himself had maintained for thousands of hours over the past 3 years. But as the changing of the guard ceremony began, James felt like he was not just ending a shift, but concluding one chapter of his life and beginning another. The formal exchange was conducted with the usual precision and ceremony, but James could sense that his replacement, Sergeant Williams, was aware that something extraordinary had taken place. The crowd that had gathered was unlike any typical tourist gathering, and the small memorial of items on the ground told a story that needed no explanation to someone who understood military service. As James prepared to step away from his post for the final movements of the changing ceremony, he did something that surprised even himself. Instead of maintaining his forward gaze until the very last moment, he allowed his eyes to sweep across the faces of the people who had gathered to witness his emotional journey. For the first time in 3 years of service, he truly saw the individuals who made up the crowds he protected every day. There was the elderly woman who had contributed the poppy, still standing quietly with tears in her own eyes. The veteran who had left the military coin was standing at attention, his own military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. The mother who had kept vigil with her teenage son was holding her son's hand, both of them watching with expressions of deep respect. And scattered throughout the crowd were dozens of other faces, each representing someone whose life had been touched by this unexpected moment of human connection. When the ceremony concluded and James was officially relieved of his duty, he walked the prescribed route toward the palace entrance. But instead of the usual straight path, he found himself slowing down, taking a moment to really look at the memorial that had been created in front of his former position. The little girl's drawing was still there, now accompanied by the small British flag, the poppy, the military coin, and several other tokens of appreciation that visitors had quietly added throughout the evening. Sergeant Williams, now in position and maintaining the same disciplined stance that James had held all day, would become the guardian of this memorial for the remainder of the evening. James felt confident that his fellow guardsmen would understand the significance of what lay before him and would honor it appropriately. As James disappeared into the palace interior to complete his post-duty procedures, the crowd began to slowly disperse, but the impact of what they had witnessed continued to spread. The photos and stories shared on social media reached thousands of people who had not been present, but who were moved by the account of a royal guard's moment of emotional breakthrough. News outlets picked up the story, but they handled it with respect, focusing not on the breakdown of military discipline but on the beautiful reminder of the humanity that exists within those who serve. The little girl who had started it all was indeed at home having dinner with her family when her teacher called to tell her parents about the impact their daughter's gesture had made. When they explained to her that her drawing had helped the guard feel appreciated and understood, she smiled and asked if she could draw more pictures for other soldiers. Her parents, understanding that their daughter possessed a special empathy and wisdom, agreed to help her find appropriate ways to continue showing appreciation for those who served. 3 days later, James received a letter through official palace channels. It was from the little girl, whose teacher had helped her find the proper address. In careful handwriting, she had written, "Dear Mr. Guard, I hope my picture helped you know that we think you are very brave, and we are thankful for you. My teacher told me that sometimes brave people feel sad, and that is okay. I drew you another picture of you smiling because I hope you can smile sometimes when you're not working." Enclosed was indeed another drawing, this one showing a soldier in civilian clothes, smiling broadly, surrounded by family and friends. At the bottom she had written, "This is you being happy when you go home." James kept both drawings in his personal belongings, and they became touchstones for him as he continued his military career. The experience had taught him that true strength came not from suppressing his humanity, but from allowing it to inform and deepen his service to others. He remained an exemplary guardsman, but he also became someone who could accept and appreciate the gratitude of those he served. Years later, when James eventually retired from military service, he would often speak to school groups about the importance of showing appreciation for those who serve others. And he would always tell them about a little girl with a yellow ribbon in her hair, whose simple gesture of respect and gratitude had reminded him why service to others was the highest calling he could have chosen. The moment at Buckingham Palace became part of palace lore, a reminder to all who served there that their duty was not just about maintaining traditions and ceremonies, but about preserving the human connections that make service meaningful. And somewhere in a small town outside London, a young girl continued to draw pictures for soldiers, never fully understanding the profound impact her empathy and gratitude had on those who dedicated their lives to protecting others.